Welcome back to the channel. It's the Fantasy Football Strategist here. If you haven't seen them yet, check out my top 24 quarterback rankings and top 36 wide receiver rankings. They've just been released in the past 2 days. In today's video, we're going over the top 36 running backs for the 2024 fantasy football season. And later this week, I'm going to have the top 24 tight ends for this season. Please remember to like and subscribe. So to begin the tier, we have Rico Dowdle, Chase Brown, Zach Moss, and Blake Corum. So Rico Dowdle is 5'11", 213 pounds, so he has a 29.7 BMI. That is just slightly under the 30.0 threshold, but it is relatively close enough to be theoretically a bell cow. They do, however, have Ezekiel Elliott in town on a one-year deal, so he's likely to split carries and then receive most of the receiving work. So as far as his metrics, he has a 4.54 40-yard dash, which is in the 67th percentile, with a 100.3 speed score, which is in the 68th percentile, a 128.1 burst score, which is in the 89th percentile. One thing about him, his overall metrics in general aren't overly impressive, except for this one. His 3.92 yards created per touch were good for 9th in the NFL. So what that stat is it's his ability to create yards himself without the help of scheming or offensive linemen when it's all up to him. So if he's able to get around half of the carries, give or take, and then most of the receiving work, he could absolutely be an RB3 this season. With Zeke Elliott there, don't project him to be anywhere close to being an RB1. Next we have Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. So he's 5'10", 209 pounds. That gives him a 30.0 BMI. That is exactly at the requisite size necessary to be potentially a featured back. And he's only 24.4 years old, so he's still relatively young. The only issue is the player in front of him, Zach Moss. He's going to be in a timeshare. Now, while I do expect him to be used primarily in the receiving game and get a good amount of targets, I do think he's going to get probably a little bit less than half of the actual rush attempts. So I think it's going to give him a very, very good floor on a week-to-week basis. But without an injury to Zach Moss, I just don't see the upside to really bet on here in terms of him potentially being an RB1. Now, if Zach Moss were to get hurt, he absolutely has a chance. So looking at his metrics, he had a 4.43 40-yard dash, which is in the 92nd percentile. He had a 108.5 speed score, which is in the 89th percentile. He had a 131.5 burst score, which is in the 95th percentile. And his 25 bench reps were in the 87th percentile. One advanced stat to like is his 0.91 fantasy points per opportunity were good for 12th in the entire NFL. So he was obviously behind Joe Mixon this past season. Well, he's likely to get more run because Joe Mixon was treated as a featured back. Zach Moss isn't the best running back in the world, so with them being in a timeshare, I think that the ceiling of both is capped, and he's probably just going to be a low-end RB3, but he does have the potential, should Zach Moss get hurt, to be a little bit further up these rankings. At RB34, I have Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals. So at 5'9", 223, he has a 32.9 BMI, which is well above the 30.0 threshold necessary to be a featured back. So he does have the frame to be a featured back. He just isn't, in my opinion, talented enough. And with Chase Brown there as well in Cincinnati, he's just not going to be a featured back. I do think he's going to receive more than half of the actual carries this year and some receiving work. He's just not an amazing receiver. He's 26.6 years old, so he's not too old to produce anymore. I think that the amazing scheme in Indianapolis this past season really helped him look a little bit better than he truly is. In Buffalo, he never was able to take the job from Devon Singletary, and now while Devon Singletary is an underrated back, he's not an elite back or anything, and neither is Zach Moss. He's going to get the goal line touchdowns, so his red zone work is going to be good for you this season. It's just his upside is essentially capped without an injury to Chase Brown. When we look at his metrics, his 4.65 40-yard dash was in the 30th percentile. His 95.4 speed score is in the 48th percentile. and his 19 bench reps are in the 44th percentile. So he's really not an amazing athlete by NFL standards, at least. And with this muddy situation here in Cincinnati, I just think he's going to be a low-end running back 3 for you. He may have a couple boom weeks here and there if he's able to get, 2 touchdowns or something, but without an injury to Chase Brown, his upside is absolutely capped this season. Next, we have Blake Corum at RB33. So he's 5'8", 205 pounds. That gives him a 31.2 BMI, well above the 30.0 threshold to potentially be a featured back in the NFL. He was drafted in the second half of the 3rd round this year to the Los Angeles Rams, and he is 23.7 years old, so a little bit old for a prospect coming out, but we don't care about that for 2024 because he's obviously less than 24 years old. So he goes to the Rams, right? They already have Kiron Williams, who was a very, very good back for us last year. It is a bit surprising because Kiron Williams is just not a good athlete, and usually there's a strong correlation between being an elite athlete and then being an elite asset at the running back position. He's just very technically skilled and very good for this scheme with his amazing vision. So what do? They draft Blake Corum. This is a little bit of a muddy situation. Sean McVay has stated that he does want to utilize both backs this season. So I think there is going to be some initial production for Blake Corum. I just think that at first it's going to be a little bit slow for him. But should Kiron Williams go down for a substantial amount of time, Blake Corum has RB1 upside. This Sean McVay scheme is absolutely conducive to fantasy success for running backs. They have Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp to keep defenses honest and prevent them from stacking the box against the run. When we look at Blake Corum's metrics, his 4.5 340-yard dash was in the 70th percentile. That gives him a 97.4 speed score, which is in the 55th percentile. Although his 10.94 agility score is in the 94th percentile. So Blake Corum is one of those backs that's very good at breaking tackles. He's a bowling ball in the open field. He just lacks the top-shelf speed that we would prefer in our running backs. But he's very technically skilled, and he is very good at gaining yards after contact. So he's going to be a good fit for the Los Angeles Rams because he also has good vision, by the way, which is part of why Kiron Williams is so effective in this game. It's just he is going to need an injury to Kiron Williams to really be an asset for us in the 2024 fantasy season. The next tier of running backs is Devon Singletary, Brian Robinson, Taj Spears, Javante Williams, and Zamir White. So first we have Devon Singletary of the New York Giants. So he's 5'7", 203 pounds. His 31.8 BMI is very impressive. So while people view Devon Singletary as a very small running back, he has very good size and a good frame considering he is 5'7". And at 26.9 years old, he still should have some juice left. Now, his situation is absolutely terrible. The New York Giants have a terrible offensive line, a poor quarterback. They only have one really scary wide receiver in Malik Neighbors. So the offense is not going to be scaring anybody this year. They're not going to be scoring a lot of points. But he is going to get a good amount of volume. Now, one thing is he is very good at getting chunk yardage. He just doesn't have the speed necessarily to score a lot of the time. So his 4.66 40-yard dash was in the 28th percentile among running backs, and his 86.1 speed score is in the 17th percentile, along with his 118.0 burst score, which is in the 47th percentile, and his 11.72 agility score, which is in the 19th percentile. So essentially, this profile should not have hit ever for us in fantasy. He's just a technically skilled running back because he is one of the worst athletes by NFL standards I've ever seen. His 10 breakaway runs, however, were good for 15th in the NFL. So like I said, he's very good at gaining chunk yardage. He just doesn't score a lot of long touchdowns because he isn't that fast. I just think this season he's going to have to live off of volume, and he's definitely not going to score many touchdowns because this Giants offense is going to be terrible. Thus, giving him probable low end to mid RB3 upside, and if he has a game where he gets a bunch of catches, maybe he could give you an RB2 week, but he's generally not going to be an asset that you particularly want to draft early in your fantasy drafts this season. At RB31, I have Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. So he's 6'2", 224 pounds. That gives him a 28.8 BMI. He's viewed as a huge running back, but it's really just that he's tall. It's not that he's per se that large for his frame. And he's 25.4 years old. He finished as the RB21 this past season. However, the Commanders brought in Austin Eckler and drafted Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels is going to score a lot of rushing touchdowns, and then Austin Eckler is going to snatch up a lot of the receptions that Robinson had this past season, thus really capping his upside without an injury to Austin Eckler. I just think he's going to be a touchdown-dependent RB3 for you because he's not going to receive as many targets, or he generally, compared to Austin Eckler, should not be getting any targets. So while he's going to be used some in the passing game, he's not going to get a majority of the targets. And while he is going to get a good amount of carries, Jayden Daniels is an absolute threat in the red zone. Now, when we look at his metrics, his 4.53 40-yard dash was in the 70th percentile, giving him a 106.4 speed score, which is in the 85th percentile. So he's relatively fast considering he's 6'2". But as far as his metrics go, he's really not that great of a running back. He's just solid at everything. The only thing he led the league in was yards per reception by running backs, and that's just because he happened to get a long touchdown on, I think it was a flat or a screen route this past year. So it is a little bit deceptive, that stat at least. But like I said, his upside is absolutely capped with Jayden Daniels stealing rushing touchdowns and Austin Eckler stealing a good majority of the receptions. At RB30, I have Taj Spears of the Tennessee Titans. He finished as the RB34 this past season. He's 5'10", 201 pounds with a 28.8 BMI. He was drafted in the 3rd round this past year, and he's 23.1 years old. So he goes from having Derrick Henry in front of him to having Tony Pollard in front of him. I view this as good and bad in a way and somewhat offsetting. Now, while Derrick Henry is going to get just about any rushing touchdown in this offense if he was in front of him, Tony Pollard, to be fair, is not the size of Derrick Henry, so there is a little bit more rushing touchdown potential for Taj Spears this year. However, Tony Pollard is much better in the receiving game than Derrick Henry has ever been. So I think that is going to somewhat offset, and I think this is going to be a nearly even running back by committee situation. I think it's going to curb both players' upside. However, with the Titans deciding to pay Tony Pollard, I do suspect he's going to get a little bit more than half of the touches, thus giving him a little bit more of a boost in these rankings, and really just curbing Taj Spears' upside. So when we look at his metrics, his 4.59 40-yard dash is in the 50th percentile, giving him a 90.6 speed score, which is in the 30th percentile. He does, however, have a 128.8 burst score, which is in the 90th percentile, but his agility score of 11.59 is in the 29th percentile. So he's really just a very fundamentally sound running back. He has a very, very good juke move. He's good at creating yards himself. He's kind of like Devon Singletary in that he's not the best athlete, but he's just good at being a running back. And if he was a little bit bigger and was a little bit better of an athlete by NFL standards at least, he would have a ton more upside than he does this season. For instance, his 26.3 juke rate was good for 4th in the NFL. His 7.0% breakaway run rate was good for 5th in the NFL, and his 4.58 yards created per touch was good for 5th as well. So like I said, very good at creating yards himself. He does have a good juke move. It's just that he is a limited athlete and going to be in a timeshare in which I think he's going to receive right around or less than 50% of the total touches, thus making him, in my opinion, a running back 3 unless something were to happen to Tony Pollard this year. At running back 29, I have Javante Williams of the Denver Broncos. Funnily enough, he finished as the RB29 this past season. There's no correlation there, though. He is 5'10", 212 pounds, which gives him a 30.4 BMI. That is the requisite size to be a bell cow back. And he is only 24.3 years old. Now, 2 seasons ago, he sustained a devastating multi-ligament knee injury, which he was not fully recovered from this past season. I do expect him to be fully recovered this year. Will he be back to where he was pre-injury? It's going to be hard to tell. I would expect him to be a lot closer this year than he was this past season. The only issue, they still have Samaje Perine, for now at least. They drafted Audric Estime, and they still have Jaleel McLaughlin. So I do think it's going to be somewhat of a crowded backfield, and it's going to be interesting to see the splits. I do think, though, that Javante Williams is going to get a majority of the actual rushes, even if he doesn't get the receiving work, thus limiting his upside. But I think the Broncos are going to want to run as much as they possibly can to take the load off of Bo Nix and not expose him to the NFL, at least as much as they possibly can. So I do think he does have a solid floor because I think he's going to get a lot of volume, at least on the ground. But with this crowded backfield and what projects to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL, I just don't see the upside. So when we look at his metrics, his 4.62 40-yard dash is in the 40th percentile. His 93.1 speed score is in the 40th percentile. So he's not really a fast running back, but he is a very, very shifty running back, and he breaks a lot of tackles. So his 122.7 burst score is in the 72nd percentile, and his 11.02 agility score is in the 90th percentile. So like I said, not an overtly fast running back, probably not going to be breaking any 80-yard touchdowns, but he is very good at getting chunk gains. In fact, his 5.5 breakaway run rate was good for 9th in the NFL, and his 12 breakaway runs were good for 8th in the NFL. So like I said, he's kind of like Devon Singletary in that regard, in that he's going to get you a lot of 15 to 30-yard gains. He's just not going to break off an 80-yard touchdown probably ever. And I think he's going to be a volume-driven running back 3 that just doesn't have the upside unless there are multiple injuries and the offense is a little bit better than expected. At RB28, I have Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders. This might surprise a couple of people. I know he's been steamed up a little bit. I think he's just a guy, though. He was a 5-star recruit at Georgia, but he had 2 devastating knee injuries in college. I believe it was to both knees as well. And he just hasn't looked like the same player since. He's 6 foot 214 with a 29.0 BMI, so below the requisite 30.0 threshold that you would prefer for somebody that has the profile to be a bell cow. And while he is only 24.9 years old and is going to get a majority, if not basically all of the running touches here, they drafted Dylan Labe, who is one of the better receiving backs that we've seen in recent memory coming out of college. So I do think he's going to see a split backfield situation here where he doesn't get the receptions, but he gets a good majority of the rushes. The other problem, the Raiders are going to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL. They have either Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew being their quarterback, with Antonio Pierce as their head coach, so a defensive-minded head coach. They do have Devontae Adams and Brock Bowers outside, so that could free up some rushing room, but their offensive line isn't that great either. So overall, I do think he's being overvalued by a good majority of people, honestly, because I just don't see the upside here without a lot of receiving work and with it just being a poor offense. I will say his 4.8% breakaway run rate was good for 16th in the NFL this past year. So he is going to get chunk gains here and there. I just think that the upside is honestly at most, assuming an injury to Dylan Labe, maybe a mid RB2 if he's able to get all of the rushing work and all of the receiving work. It's just that the touchdown upside is not likely to be there for him, thus limiting his total upside. The next tier consists of Raheem Mostert, James Conner, Tony Pollard, Jonathan Brooks, and David Montgomery. So at RB27, I have Raheem Mostert. Now, he is coming off an RB5 finish. This was heavily inflated by, it was a total of 21 total touchdowns, 18 on the ground and 3 through the air. That's incredibly unlikely to repeat. He's 5'11", 205 pounds, so 28.6 BMI, and he's 32.3 years old. So while one thing is he does have a lot less wear and tear than you would expect for somebody being this old in the NFL, but he's never been able to stay healthy, basically ever, which we can't predict injuries, so don't use that as the end-all, be-all of drafting him or avoiding him. It's just that he has never proven to be able to be a consistent three-down running back in his career. And he finds himself in Miami, which is, to be fair to him, the perfect situation. The only issue is, this past season, his only competition was Devon Etienne, who was hurt a solid amount of the season and didn't play a good amount of games. Well, the Dolphins drafted Jaylen Warren, so I do think this is going to be somewhat of a three-man committee. And while I do predict Raheem Mostert to get the most rushing attempts of any of these three running backs, it's just with this crowded running back room now, I think that his ceiling is going to be significantly diminished, although he absolutely, make no mistake, could finish above the RB27. I'm just not going to bet on him particularly finishing anywhere remotely close to his RB5 finish this past season. Now, when we look at his metrics, his 4.43 40-yard dash is in the 92nd percentile, his 106.5 speed score is in the 85th percentile, his 134.0 burst score is in the 97th percentile, and his 11.2 agility score is in the 76th percentile. So he's a very, very good athlete. Who knows if he's going to fall off this season, and he's probably going to receive a lot less touches. Now, I will say his 6.7 breakaway run rate was good for 6th in the NFL, while his 14 total breakaway runs were good for 4th, and his 24.8% juke rate was good for 7th this past season. He's a very technically skilled running back and an amazing athlete. It's a shame he isn't younger. I just think he's going to give you massive, massive boom weeks, but he's also going to have a very, very low floor, with this possibly being a three-man committee now. Next, we have James Conner at RB26. He's coming off an RB18 finish with the Arizona Cardinals. He's 6'1", 233, so has a 30.7 BMI. The only issue is he's 29.2 years old, and while, once again, I'll say it once and I'll say it a million more times, we can't predict injuries, one thing to note is he's never, ever in his entire career played more than 13 games in a season. And age 28, by the way, is the last year in general, with the exception of extreme outliers like Raheem Mostert. 28 is the peak age in general that you're going to have a peak season in production for a running back. And then what did they do? Well, they drafted Trey Benson at the top of the 3rd round. Trey Benson is a very, very good running back. I do think that James Conner, at least to begin the season, is going to be predominantly used in the backfield. I just think that he isn't going to receive 100% of the work, essentially like he did this past season. I think it's probably going to be about a 70-30% timeshare. But if James Conner is to get hurt at any point, Trey Benson could take over the job and probably isn't giving it back. But I will say, though, he is a very, very skilled running back and is actually one of the better running backs in the NFL. It's really a shame that he's not been able to stay healthy a good majority of his career. When we look at his metrics, he's actually not the best athlete. He's just very technically skilled. So his 4.65 40-yard dash is in the 30th percentile, giving him a 99.7 speed score, which is in the 65th percentile. His 105.8 burst score is in the 6th percentile. His 11.72 agility score is in the 19th percentile. I will say, though, his 24.7% juke rate was good for 8th in the NFL. His 58 total evaded tackles was good for 10th. His 6.3% breakaway run rate was good for 7th. And his 13 total breakaway runs were good for 6th. So with them drafting Trey Benson, him being 29.2 years old, and never having played more than 13 games in any individual season, I think a low-end RB2 finish is in his future this season. He is going to have boom weeks, but I think that his floor is potentially being replaced should he miss time with injury and Trey Benson be able to take over the backfield. At RB25, I have Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. He just signed a 3-year deal that's really more of a 2-year deal that could be a 1-year deal depending on his performance. He was the RB14 this past season. I don't think that's going to repeat. He's 6 foot 210 pounds with a 28.5 BMI. Definitely nowhere close to the 30.0 requisite threshold for being a bell cow running back. As I said earlier with Taj Spears, he's going to be in a timeshare. I do think he's going to probably get a little bit more than half of the total touches. He's 27.2 years old, so he does potentially have some juice left. He was coming off of a broken leg this past year, which I think contributed to him having a little bit of a disappointing season. And I just think that this offense is going to be underrated. I think it's going to be around middle of the pack in terms of scoring. It's just that without an injury to Taj Spears, he's not likely to repeat as the RB14, and I'm not going to rank people based on an assumption that someone gets injured. I will say, though, he is very good at creating yards himself. His run blocking was not the best this past season. People generally have this idea that Dallas's offensive line is among the absolute best because of how good they used to be when they had Travis Frederick, Zach Martin, and Tyron Smith in their prime, back when Zeke Elliott was there. This is not the same offensive line. It's not quite as good as it used to be, this past season anyways. Now he goes to the Titans. It is a Callahan offense, so I do suspect that it's going to be a lot better than Mike Vrabel's was this past year. It's just with him being in a timeshare, he's likely not going to be anywhere close to an RB1. He did have 971 total yards created himself, which is good for 8th in the NFL. So he could have had a much better season if his run blocking was better. But he was also the featured back until he really underperformed and gave Rico Dowdle an opportunity to come in. It's just with this timeshare, as I said earlier, I don't expect anything more than a low-end RB2 season without an injury to Taj Spears. Next, at RB24, I have Jonathan Brooks of the Carolina Panthers. So he's a rookie. He was just drafted in the 2nd round this season. The Panthers did trade up to draft him, so that is a good sign for his potential to be a bell cow and to be featured as a running back. He's 6 foot 216 with a 29.3 BMI. Not quite the 30.0 threshold that we would prefer for a bell cow, but Dave Canales has in general used one running back as a bell cow. He did so with Rashad White this past season, and Rashad White is a terrible runner of the football. So I do expect that to continue, especially considering their investment. He is coming off a torn ACL and likely to miss probably at least 4 games and then start off the season a little bit slow, which is the only reason why I have him ranked as the RB24. If he was not coming off an injury, he would probably be closer to the RB 12 to 10 for me, especially given the Dave Canales system. I do think that he's going to pick up a lot of steam, and if you can get him late enough in your drafts, is going to lead many people to fantasy championships this year. And he's getting the injury discount in terms of his ADP. Like I said, though, I think he's going to miss a couple of games, probably at least 4, then start out the year a little bit slow, but then really pick up some steam towards the end of the year. So I think he's going to be much lower than this ranking for a good majority of the year, but then pick up a lot of steam at the end and probably finish as a low-end RB2. At RB23, I have David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So he finished as the RB17 this past season. At the beginning of this past season, he was receiving the majority of the work while they brought along Jahmyr Gibbs a little slowly. Then Jahmyr Gibbs started to pick up a lot of steam, and David Montgomery was injured. Then by the end of the season, it was a somewhat even timeshare, but the upside is much more in Gibbs' favor because David Montgomery is not going to be used in the receiving game as much as Jahmyr Gibbs. He is, however, 5'10", 222 pounds, giving him a 31.9 BMI, well above the 30.0 threshold to be a bell cow running back, and he's still only 27.1 years old, so he still should have some juice left. But like I said, he's going to be in a timeshare with Jahmyr Gibbs, and he's not going to receive a lot of the receiving work, which does make him a little bit touchdown dependent. Now, to be fair, the Lions are one of the most high-scoring offenses in the NFL, and with Ben Johnson returning as their offensive coordinator, I do expect them to remain among the leaders in efficiency. But it's going to take an injury to Jahmyr Gibbs in season for him to be much more than the RB 20 or so. And so Jahmyr Gibbs was injured yesterday. It was a hamstring injury. It's been reported that there is no ACL tear to go with it. People were spreading potentially false rumors about him. Now, the only issue is I don't think that's going to keep Jahmyr Gibbs out of the Week 1 opener. And even if it does, it's probably not going to keep him out much longer than that. So I think people freaking out about Jahmyr Gibbs are kind of overreacting, unless it is much worse than we're hearing right now, which no one will know until it's further reported on. So I'm still going to keep David Montgomery at RB23. I think that his role is going to be a little bit less than it was this past season, with Jahmyr Gibbs being brought along slowly. And I think he's going to be a touchdown-dependent RB2 for you guys, with a generally safe floor, but an absolutely capped ceiling without an injury to Jahmyr Gibbs, which would keep him out for an extended period of time. So the next tier consists of Jaylen Warren, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, and James Cook. So at RB22, I have Jaylen Warren. He also coincidentally finished as the RB22 this past season. So he's 5'8", 207 pounds with a 31.5 BMI. Absolutely the requisite size to be a bell cow in the NFL. And he's 25.7 years old. The only issue, he is undrafted, so the team has no commitment with him. And he's in a timeshare with Najee Harris in what projects to be a very low-scoring offense. In fact, one of the worst offenses in the NFL this season. They brought in Arthur Smith, who likes to run a power run game, which is going to be a little bit more favorable to Najee Harris, even though I think Jaylen Warren is the better back. Jaylen Warren, as a matter of fact, is one of the better running backs in the NFL. It's just with this lack of commitment from the team, and with Najee Harris potentially being a little bit more of a scheme fit, even though it's been reported that Jaylen Warren looks like the better running back, which I think is true. It's just with them both being stuck in a timeshare with the two of them, that their upsides are both capped, and without an injury to the other, neither one is going to finish as an RB1. I will say, though, his 4.9 true yards per carry were good for 6th in the NFL. His 5.5 yards per touch were good for 7th. His 31.9% juke rate was 1st in the entire NFL this past season. His 67 total evaded tackles were good for 5th. His 8.1% breakaway run rate was good for 3rd. And his 12 total breakaway runs were good for 8th. So this guy gets chunk gains with the best of them. He's very shifty in the open field, and he's an above-average receiver as well. It is just a shame for him that Najee Harris is in town. So essentially, I view him as a mid to low-end RB2 without an injury to Najee Harris, who is going to give you a very, very safe floor from week to week, but is going to lack the high ceiling that we would prefer with a lot of the running backs ahead of him. So my RB21 is Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's 6'1", 232 pounds, so that gives him a 30.6 BMI. He's 26.4 years old. Now the team did decline his 5th-year option, so they may run him into the ground this season. They may just use him in a timeshare once again and then dump him after the season's over. They could re-sign him to a team-friendly deal. That remains to be seen. Like I said with Jaylen Warren, his upside is absolutely capped. I do think he's going to receive more of the rushing attempts this year, with Jaylen Warren receiving a good amount of the receiving work because Jaylen Warren's a better receiver. He's actually a better runner of the ball too, but Najee Harris fits the power run game that Arthur Smith likes. And with this being a potentially terrible offense overall in terms of their overall point scoring, I think that both have a very limited ceiling. Now, Najee Harris could have a couple 20-point games if he's able to have a multi-touchdown game or something, but with Jaylen Warren getting most of the receiving work and it being somewhat of a timeshare, he's just going to be a safe floor, reduced ceiling type of running back, which some of these running backs ahead of him are just going to present you with a lot more upside without the necessity of an injury to his running back mate. At RB20, I have DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. He's 5'8", 212 pounds, which does give him a 32.2 BMI, well above the 30.0 threshold to be a bell cow back. I do suspect he's going to be generally used as a bell cow. He signed a 3-year deal with the Bears that's probably going to be a 2-year deal. He's only 25.5 years old, so his best days still could potentially be ahead of him. He goes into an offense that is going to be quite explosive this season, in my opinion. They drafted Caleb Williams at quarterback. He's going to be their primary pass-catching back, and in my opinion, receive a good majority of the rushes, even if Roschon Johnson sneaks in a couple. It's just with the assortment of playmakers on this team, I do think it's going to be quite balanced and potentially limit him. And with Caleb Williams being very, very good in the red zone through the air and especially on the ground, he had 10 touchdowns in 2 of his 3 collegiate seasons. I think that he's going to steal some of the rushing touchdowns that could potentially be DeAndre Swift's, and DeAndre Swift may not be used as the red zone back, thus limiting his weekly upside potentially. I do think that he's going to be a solid RB2 for you, though. He's going to probably have big boom weeks for you, but I do think his floor is going to be a little bit limited, especially if he's not able to get a good amount of rushing touchdowns this year. At RB19, I have Ramondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. So he's 5'11", 231 pounds with a 32.2 BMI. He's a big running back who's not the best athlete. He's just technically skilled and a pretty good receiver as well. He's 26.4 years old. He just signed an extension with the Patriots, so he should be in town for at least 2 more seasons. Now, as far as being an athlete, he ran a 4.69 40-yard dash, which is in the 22nd percentile. Now, with him having a 32.2 BMI, that did give him a 95.5 speed score, which is in the 48th percentile. It's just his 109.6 burst score was in the 12th percentile. Although I will say his 69th percentile agility score really does go to show that while he is a big running back, he is very technically proficient at the running back position. He has a relatively good juke move, and he is an asset in the receiving game. I do suspect that they're going to give him a heavy amount of work to protect either Jacoby Brissett or potentially Drake May, or even if reports in camp are right and Joe Milton somehow wins the starting job. Now, he is coming off an RB35 season in which he was hurt, so his advanced stats aren't really going to help his case, but in 2022, he was a very, very good running back. I think he's going to return to form this season, and he's going to be leaned on heavily. I think he's going to have big boom weeks when he is able to score a touchdown, and I think he's going to have a very solid floor because they're going to want to pound the rock as much as they possibly can to protect whichever of their quarterbacks is starting this season. At RB18, I have James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. He's 5'11", 199 pounds, which gives him a 27.8 BMI, well below the 30.0 threshold to be a bell cow. And he's not going to be a bell cow this year. He's only 24.8 years old, so he should still have some tread left on the tires. It's just that they drafted Ray Davis, who is absolutely going to steal a good amount of rushing touchdowns this season, as well as Josh Allen, who has always stolen most of the rushing touchdowns. So overall, he has 2 players immediately capping his rushing upside. Then with Josh Allen and Ray Davis potentially eating into his carries, that leaves you with the receiving work, which I do think is going to give him a very, very solid floor on a week-to-week basis. But I doubt that he repeats this RB12 finish, to be honest with you. I'd be absolutely shocked. He's just going to be a very safe floor, very low ceiling player in this offense, in my opinion. So the next tier consists of Rashad White, Kenneth Walker, Alvin Kamara, Isaiah Pacheco, Aaron Jones, and Joe Mixon. So I have Rashad White at RB17. He's coming off an RB4 season. I think he's going to have probably the largest fall of any running back in terms of his prior end-of-season finish to this year's end-of-season finish. Dave Canales is no longer their head coach, so I think their offensive efficiency is going to go massively down. He's 6'2", 214, so he doesn't have the 30.0 threshold for being a bell cow back, even though he was still used as one. They did bring in Bucky Irving, and while he isn't projected to be a featured back or anything, I think he is going to eat into the touches. And Rashad White is just not a good runner of the football. He is I would say he's an elite receiving back though, which is going to give him a solid floor on a week-to-week basis. I just think this offense is not going to be remotely as good as it was this past season, and he's definitely not going to receive the massive volume he did this past season either. So I think that he's going to be a fine RB2 for you with a very high floor but a low ceiling on a week-to-week basis. Now, we go from, in my opinion, one of, if not the worst rushers of the football to one of, if not the best rusher of the football in the NFL in Kenneth Walker. He is only my RB16, but that's due to them having Zach Charbonnet, so I do suspect that he's going to be in somewhat of a committee. But this guy's 5'9", 211 pounds with a 31.2 BMI. That is well over the 30.0 threshold. He's still only 23.8 years old, so he still should have a ton of tread left on the tires. And this guy is an elite athlete. So his 4.38 40-yard dash is in the 98th percentile, giving him a 114.7 speed score, which is in the 96th percentile. And a couple of stats to show how good he is as a runner of the football. His 29.0% juke rate was good for second in the NFL, and his 72 total evaded tackles were good for third, as well as his 10 breakaway runs were good for 15th. So, like I said, one of the better runners of the football. It's just he's going to be in a committee. I do expect this to be a little bit more of a balanced attack this season in terms of the run game and pass game. They brought in Grubb from the Washington Huskies, their former offensive coordinator, and I think he's going to bring a lot more balance, like I said a second ago. They're going to use condensed formations to get their receivers open, and I think he's going to unlock the trio of wide receivers a little bit at the expense of the running backs. Now, I do think he's going to finish a little bit higher than he did this past season, but I do think with the timeshare, it's going to curb his total season finish. Although, on a week-to-week basis, this guy has elite RB1 upside. This guy could score 30 points in a game, and it wouldn't surprise you at all. But like I said, in this timeshare, I view him as an RB2. At RB15, I have Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. He's 5'10", 214, and now while he does have a 30.7 BMI, he is 29 years old, which, as I stated earlier, is past the 28.0 general historical time in which a running back can have a peak season of production. And we have seen some rushing decline for Alvin Kamara the past 2 seasons, really. However, he does remain one of the best pass-catching playmakers at the running back position that there is. So he finished second in the NFL with 75 receptions this past season, giving him 1.73 yards per out run, which was good for fourth, and an 86.2 catch rate, which was good for fifth in the NFL. So like I said, a very, very good pass-catching running back, just becoming less efficient as he has more wear and tear on his body. I think just like with some of these other guys, he's going to be a very safe floor player, but I do expect Kendre Miller, who they selected this past season, to eat into his rushing attempts just a little bit, and this offense is not going to be very good. Dennis Allen is still their head coach, and Derek Carr is their quarterback. That is not conducive to fantasy success. But I think even with a little bit more decline in the run game, his receiving ability is going to keep him afloat and make him a safe RB2 for you. And if Kendre Miller were to get hurt, there is potential for him to finish a little bit higher than this. It's just the offense is not going to be very good, and with him being in somewhat of a timeshare, even if he receives a good amount of work, I think his upside is a little bit limited. Up next at RB14, I have Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. He finished as the RB15 this past season. He's 5'10", 216 pounds with a 31.0 BMI, so over the 30.0 threshold. He's still only 24.4 years old. So with him, he is a battering ram. He is one of the most aggressive running backs I've ever seen. Kind of reminds me of Steven Jackson in a way, but he's a much better athlete. So his 4.37 40-yard dash is in the 99th percentile, giving him a 118.5 speed score, which is in the 98th percentile, along with a 56th percentile agility score. So he's an above average, well above average, as a matter of fact, running back in terms of his athleticism. So I do think he does have a sneaky amount of upside. He's generally not viewed as one of the better running backs in the league. And now, while I don't think he's an elite running back, I think being a solid running back and in what projects to be an elite offense does give him a good amount of upside. I just think that his weekly floor of maybe 6 to 8 points is going to keep him from being one of the top backs this season. At RB13, I have Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings. So he's a very good receiving back. In fact, his 1.85 yards per out run this past season was good for second in the NFL among the running back position. He has, however, experienced some decline in his rushing ability. He's 5'9", 208 pounds with a 30.7 BMI. So that has allowed him generally to be a bell cow, even though they've tried to make A.J. Dillon the bell cow in Green Bay. But he's 29.7 years old, so like I said, advancing in age. That's past the 28 general age in which running backs are going to have either hit that season or already hit their peak season in production. But with Minnesota, he finds himself surrounded by playmakers in Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and when he returns, T.J. Hawkinson, along with a very, very good offensive-minded head coach in Kevin O'Connell. So I think he's going to have a very safe floor because he's going to get a ton of receptions. Now, Sam Darnold is going to be their quarterback for it's looking like at least the beginning of the season for sure, because J.J. McCarthy is going to have surgery now. But I think it's still going to be a potent enough offense that he's still going to be a threat to score touchdowns. And I think he's going to have a very solid floor with a couple big boom weeks. It's just we're going to have to see how much he's going to decline the season in terms of his rushing ability. So at RB12, I have Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. He's 6'1", 228 pounds. That gives him a 30.1 BMI. He's 28 years old, so right at the end of the potential for him having a peak production season. He is coming off a year in which he had 990 yards created, which was good for 6th in the NFL. So he's very good at creating something from nothing. And he just finished as the RB6, as a matter of fact. I do think it's going to decline just a little bit because while he is going to the Houston Texans and they're going to have a very potent offense, I think they're going to be able to pass the ball a lot more than the Bengals were this past season with Joe Burrow being injured. But I think he's going to have a very solid floor and a potential for a large ceiling on a week-to-week basis in this potent offense. I just think that there's more talented backs in solid situations ahead of him that have a good amount more upside, potentially at least. So the next tier consists of Kiron Williams, Devon Singletary, Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, and Derrick Henry. At RB11, I have Kiron Williams. He is one of the worst athletes in the NFL at the running back position, and he's only 5'9", 194 pounds with a 28.6 BMI, with a 4.65 40-yard dash, which was in the 30th percentile, an 83 speed score, which is in the 9th percentile, a 112.4 burst score, which is in the 20th percentile, and an 11.4 agility score, which is in the 51st percentile. So while he is one of the worst running backs in terms of being an athlete and size, he's very technically proficient at the position and in a wonderful scheme with Sean McVay. So his 937 yards created were good for 9th in the NFL this past year, and his 23.5% juke rate was good for 10th. So he's very good. He has great vision and creates yards himself. It's a shame for him that he's not a better athlete by NFL standards, at least. And they did draft Blake Corum, so I think he's going to eat into his carries, and it's going to create somewhat of a timeshare. Although I do think that Kiron Williams is probably an RB1 this season, albeit a low-end RB1. I just think that his ceiling is going to be a little bit more capped, and his floor is going to be lower with them bringing Blake Corum into the fold. So I think he's going to finish as a low-end RB1, but he's still going to have very, very high-end weeks when he's able to get a couple touchdowns. And he's still a wonderful running back to own. I just think that he's not going to repeat as the RB7 this season. At RB10, I have Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. So he's 5'9", 188 pounds with a 27.8 BMI, and he's still only 22.8 years old. So the thing is, he is a very, very small running back, but he's very, very talented and in the perfect scheme for his skills. A couple of advanced stats. His 6.6 true yards per carry was good for second in the NFL. His 7.7 yards per touch was first. His 27.7% juke rate was third. And his 12.6 breakaway run rate was good for first. And looking at his metrics, his 4.32 40-yard dash was in the 99th percentile, and despite only being 188 pounds, his 108 speed score is still in the 88th percentile. So he's very, very fast and extremely talented, and the scheme that Mike McDaniel runs with the motioning of the receivers with Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill around him is going to create a lot of running lanes and make it very challenging for defenses to stack the box. It's just that he's going to be in somewhat of a timeshare with, first of all, Raheem Mostert still there, but then they also drafted Jaylen Warren to be Mostert's eventual replacement, so I think this is going to be somewhat of a three-way committee. But Devon Achane does have 40-plus point upside any given week. It's hard to imagine he's ever going to be a featured back. So while he is going to be quite potent some weeks, I think that it's hard to project him over some of these other running backs ahead of him that will absolutely be featured backs. So next we have Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. He's 5'10", 220 pounds. That does give him a 31.6 BMI. He's been a bell cow with the Raiders throughout his entire career. He's still only 26.5 years old. He goes to Green Bay where he has Coach LaFleur, who runs a derivative of the Shanahan offense with his own personal touch on it. He's going to be surrounded by an assortment of very solid players who excel at their specific role, and I think he's going to be a featured back once again. And I think he has a lot of touchdown upside and just general upside with a very safe floor. Fun fact, Jordan Love this past season had the highest amount of reads in which the running back was the first option in the NFL this past season. So that is going to bode well for Josh Jacobs receiving this season. I do think he's going to be a featured back. I think he's going to score a ton of touchdowns. And assuming he stays healthy, I think he's going to have a solid floor with a massive ceiling. This guy's been stuck in a terrible situation his entire career, and he still has managed to finish as the RB1 once in his career with the Raiders. Now, while I wouldn't project him to be the RB1 overall, if he's lucky with his touchdowns this season, he absolutely could be. I just think that there are a couple running backs that are either in better situations or are just better talents at the position ahead of him. At RB8, I have Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. So he's 5'10", 226 with a 32.4 BMI. He's still only 25.5 years old. He is on the second contract, though, and he does have a very high amount of wear and tear on his body. 3 years ago, he finished as the RB1 with a historic season, and he's floundered in the season since then, but 1 year was due to injury, and this past season was somewhat due to injury, but mostly due to a holdout. Now, he is one of the best size-adjusted athletes we've seen in some time. So his 40-yard dash was 4.39, which puts him in the 97th percentile in and of itself, but his 121.7 speed score is in the 99th percentile, and he also has 72nd percentile burst score and 68th percentile agility. He is one of the better talents at the running back position, and he's in a Shane Steichen offense with Anthony Richardson at the helm with solid receiving options. So this is going to be an efficient offense, and I think he's going to absolutely ball out this year and finish much closer to the RB1 than the RB33. The only thing potentially limiting him is he's not the best receiving back. They do have Evan Hull, and now while he hasn't done anything because he did have a season-ending injury this past season, I do think that he or potentially even Trey Sermon may steal some of the receptions out of the backfield, and there may not be as many. But he has absolutely massive upside on a week-to-week basis, and I think he should have a solid floor as well. At RB7, I have Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So he's 5'10", 215 pounds with a 30.8 BMI, above the 30.0 threshold, and he's still only 25.5 years old. He's coming off a season in which he was the RB3. I don't think that's going to repeat, but I still think he's going to be a top 10 back. and he is one of the more underrated, under-discussed running backs. So this past season, he had 69 evaded tackles, which was good for 4th in the NFL, and his 1,080 yards created were good for 4th. He just received terrible run blocking. I do think that's going to improve with the health of their offensive line, as well as them adding Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. to be vertical playmakers in the receiving game. I think that's going to open up a lot of opportunity for him. Now, the only potential issue is he does sometimes have a relatively low floor, but he has one of the better ceilings in fantasy. He is a threat to have multiple touchdown games any given week. I do think his floor is going to improve, though, with those receiving additions in the vertical passing game. So I think that he's going to be a solid RB1 for you in fantasy in 2024. And at RB6, I have Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. So he's coming off an RB8 season. He had been with the Titans his entire career. He's 6'3", 247 pounds, which gives him a 30.9 BMI. He's been used as a workhorse extensively throughout his career and has some of the most mileage of any running back. And he's 30.6 years old, so he's definitely on the older side of being a running back. I think he does have a little bit of juice left, and with him going from the Titans to the Ravens, I think this is just about the best thing that could have happened for him. They're going to use him a ton on the ground. They're going to have a very potent offense. And by the way, if you watched my Dark Horse Candidates video a couple weeks ago, he is my Dark Horse candidate to be the RB1 this season due to a potential for a ton of rushing touchdowns. I think that he has a massive weekly ceiling, and he should have a decently high floor, even though he's not the best receiving back. So I think he's going to be a solid RB1 for you with a decent floor, but a massive ceiling on a week-to-week basis. And the final tier consists of Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, and Christian McCaffrey. So at RB5, I have Jahmyr Gibbs. He finished as the RB10, which is really impressive this past season because he was brought along really slowly, especially for top half of the first round pick. Now, he just experienced a hamstring injury, potentially a re-injury, although it's been reported that he's likely to be on track for week 1, so until that changes, he's not moving down in my rankings because he is one of the most explosive backs and one of the best offenses with, in my opinion, the best offensive line in the game. So he's 5'9", 199 pounds, which does give him only a 29.4 BMI, but he's going to be an Alvin Kamara type of player where he still has a massive ceiling, even though he's not generally going to be used as a featured back, at least at this stage of his career, and he's still only 22.4 years old. So his 4.36 40-yard dash was in the 99th percentile, and despite only being 199 pounds, his speed score of 110.1 is still in the 91st percentile among running backs, and he is one of the most talented running backs in the game. In fact, his 4.8 true yards per carry was good for 7th, his 5.4 yards per touch was good for 8th, his 23.9% juke rate was good for 9th, his 8.2 breakaway run rate was good for 2nd, and his 15 total breakaway runs was good for 3rd in the NFL this past season. Nothing's going to change. He has massive week-to-week upside, and he should have one of the better floors because he is an absolute weapon in the receiving game. There's been talks of him being used in the slot, which usually I wouldn't pay any credence to that, but he is actually talented enough to do that. And I do expect them to keep their word because Ben Johnson is one of the most creative play callers in the game. And assuming that there are no setbacks or the timetable for his return is not much further past week 1, he's going to remain at RB5 in my rankings. So at RB4, I have Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's 6'2", 233 with a 31.6 BMI. He's still 27.5 years old, and I think he's going to have the best season of his career potentially. There is a definite potential for him to be the RB1 this season. He goes from the Giants, which is the worst situation in football for running back, to the Eagles, which is one of the best. Now, he does have Jalen Hurts to contend with, who might and probably will steal rushing touchdowns away, but Saquon Barkley is going to be behind one of the best offensive lines, and this guy is just about the best athlete we've ever seen at the running back position. As a matter of fact, his 4.40 40-yard dash speed is in the 96th percentile, his 124.3 speed score is in the 99th percentile, and his 134.7 burst score is in the 97th percentile. He has just been in the worst situation imaginable, but now he's going to have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith on opposite sides of him, Dallas Goedert at tight end, one of the better lines in front of him with a competent quarterback. This guy has the absolute potential to be the RB1 and by a large margin if the touchdowns break right from this season. At RB3, I have Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So at 5'11", 215, he has a 30.0 BMI, and I think he's potentially actually going to be used as a workhorse now that Arthur Smith isn't trying to ruin his career. He's still only 22.5 years old, and he was the best running back prospect we've seen since Saquon Barkley coming out, in really quite a few years. He was just, for whatever reason, not used after being drafted 8th overall. And to be fair, neither was Kyle Pitts or Drake London, which just, it's Arthur Smith. But anyways, in terms of his actual talent, his 5.4 yards per touch was good for 9th in the NFL. His 23.2% juke rate was 11th. And his 1,041 yards created was good for 5th in the entire NFL this past season. The Ram scheme is being brought into town here, so he is going to be in a much better scheme. They have 2 quarterback upgrades. It's going to be a much more efficient offense, and Bijan Robinson absolutely could be the RB1. We're talking he could potentially be like Todd Gurley used to be in fantasy this season. At RB2, I have Breece Hall of the New York Jets. He's 5'11", 217 with a 30.3 BMI. He has been and will continue to be a workhorse running back. He's only 23.2 years old. He came back and was the RB2 overall after sustaining an ACL injury in his rookie season, and that's with Zach Wilson or worse being his quarterback. Now he has Aaron Rodgers. This guy is, in my opinion, the most, or at worst, second most talented running back in the entire NFL, potentially after Christian McCaffrey. We are about to see what it will be like for him to actually have competent quarterback play. So as far as being an athlete, his 4.39 40-yard dash was in the 97th percentile, his 116.9 speed score is in the 98th percentile, and his 131 burst score is in the 94th percentile. So this guy not only is talented, he is an elite athlete at the running back position. So despite being in an anemic offense with terrible quarterback play, his 25.8% juke rate was good for 5th in the NFL. He had 77 evaded tackles, which was 1st in the NFL, 11 breakaway runs, which was good for 11th in the NFL, and his 1,166 yards created were good for 3rd in the entire NFL. Now, he's also a great receiving option. This guy could absolutely, just like any of these guys in this tier, finish as the RB1 if things break right for him. He has massive touchdown upside if Aaron Rodgers is able to stay healthy. And draft this guy in the top 3. If this guy goes outside of the top 3 running backs, I think that's a mistake personally. Just draft this guy. He's going to be fantastic for you in fantasy this season. He's going to have a very high floor, and he has a 40-plus point ceiling. I mean, he was able to have a 40-point game in a full PPR at least with the terrible quarterback play that he had this past season. Imagine him in an efficient offense with Aaron Rodgers at the helm. The ceiling is astronomical. So at RB1, to no one's surprise, I have Christian McCaffrey. He's 5'11", 202 pounds. He only has a 28.2 BMI, but he has been treated as a workhorse his entire career. And he is potentially the most talented running back in the league, even though I think Breece Hall is absolutely up there. He is 28.1 years old, and he is dealing with a calf strain. It's looking like he's going to be available for Week 1, but if he were to miss some time, he might slip just a little bit down these rankings. And until we see him not be the RB1, I am going to have him as the RB1. He's in a fantastic offense ran by Kyle Shanahan. He has playmakers all around him, which makes it really hard for defenses to scheme against him. And he's probably the best receiving back in the game. I don't really have to explain very much to you for you to know that Christian McCaffrey is really, really good. You draft good players in good situations at the beginning of your drafts, and drafting Christian McCaffrey first overall, at least among the running back position, is probably a recipe for success. He has an extremely high floor and a massive ceiling on a week-to-week basis. Like I said, I don't need to convince you. He's going to be an elite RB1. So there you have it. Those are my top 36 running backs for the 2024 NFL season in fantasy. So if you've made it this far, do you agree with my rankings? Disagree with anybody? Did I leave somebody out that should be in the rankings? Please let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, I'm the fantasy football strategist, your NFL breaking news source, and the Dynasty and redraft implications behind said breaking news. I am building a library of information with which you can use to dominate your redraft and Dynasty leagues in 2024 and beyond. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.